is not maybe the answer that we're seeking, the answer that we're looking for, and calling that to our attention, those of us who do this work. I think that's all very helpful. Again, 67 on down, I was just like, yes, writing in the comments. And I do have written comments. Yes. This is what we need. And I recognize this paper is really quite finished and a lot of people have read it already. So I'm going to offer, because my time is short, some thoughts I had for how we get to the yes parts, or at least for me earlier, because it's, for those of you who didn't get to read the full paper, 72 pages. I found that from 54 to 72, I was really, engaged and felt I understood where we were going. And you went through great pains early on to explain your methodology. I found that to be somewhat, distracting, and wondered whether all of that, and though, again, I know there's blood, sweat, and tears here to getting this data, but I did wonder whether or not, one needed to read 25 pages of understanding your methodology to get to where we are at page 25. And I felt like I could trust you as an author earlier than page 25, that you had done this research in a very, in a way that had integrity. So I wasn't sure about the reader, though. Maybe if these are judges that you are trying to aim this paper for, you feel like you needed to go in that route. The normative thesis to me was not so clear until well into the paper. And so I guess that's what I'm leading to. And even by page 11, I'm not exactly sure, though it really starts to move for me later. I'm not exactly sure what your normative thesis and what the original contribution here, or how I'm supposed to use this. Am I supposed to duplicate this in my own practice and find this information, recreate the same kind of study? In the end, you say we should teach our students. And so I'm not sure if this is for teachers then, or if this is for the students to read and to think about as they use in their practice. So I thought that was just, if you could clarify earlier who your reader is, who you're aiming this for, what your normative, your thesis is a little more clearly, and maybe get there earlier, it would be helpful to me as a reader who's both an advocate, a law teacher, was a student, if you're directing this to any of those groups. This is a small issue, but I thought the praxis and paradox was not necessarily helpful. I liked the second part of the title so much more, and I felt like it gave me so much more to understand where you were going. My final comment, because I'm out of time, is about race. And it's hard for me to think about Fulton in Atlanta and not to think about race. These numbers, the 44%, 33%, 27.62%, the numbers of African Americans in these communities is so high compared to the national average that race sticks out for me, but you obviously don't address it head on, and that has to be purposeful. I wasn't exactly sure why that might be, and it nagged at me throughout the paper. So I'm just interested in what you all were thinking there. I maybe only saw one tenant is described as African American, and then I wasn't sure whether we're left to assume that the judges, the clerks, the landlord, that all those stakeholders are all white. And so I felt like even just addressing whether that is or is not the case early on in the paper might be helpful to the reader, because it does nag at you. Inside the black box made me think about race even more. I know you mean like a black box like the airplane, but the black box made me think about race even more, and I felt like I just needed something there. But overall, what a tremendous body of work, and thank you so much for your offering.
Thank you, Norinda, for those comments. So we're going to move to our next paper, which is Lori Huber from the University of Oregon's paper, Persecution of the Unhoused, and comments will be provided by the one and only Brenda Smith of American University's Washington College of Law. This is her first event after coming back from sabbatical, so thank you, Brenda, for providing these comments.
Okay.
I'll turn it over to Lori. Lori, you may be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, everyone. And I, too, am going to try to pack in a lot in 10 minutes. So the basis for this presentation, for my presentation today, was a report that I released in Eugene, Oregon in early 2020, which attempts to demonstrate the absolute futility and cost of the city's punitive system toward the unhoused, and then to compel city leaders to adopt a series of policy recommendations to reorient it toward a more community-based response that helps people overcome barriers and access housing instead of creating more barriers. And while this report is focused on Eugene, the punitive framework and disproportionate impact on the unhoused, and the cost to the local government and citizens at large is really the norm around the country, as you've heard from other speakers today. And so, brief context, the impetus for writing this report, prior to joining U of O Law School in August, I was a staff attorney at Legal Aid in Eugene, where I focused on housing advocacy. And then kind of early on in my tenure, the Boise ruling, which you heard about earlier, came down from the Ninth Circuit. And that really propelled me into homelessness advocacy and figuring out how Boise could be leveraged within Eugene. And then I also heard so many stories of people who were unhoused, getting citations, warrants, and then the unsurmountable problems that were caused as a result. And also just the fear that people who are unhoused live with about being told to move on and not feeling secure in anywhere they can be. And of course, what leads to that is sleep deprivation and a cascade of health and psychological problems. And as you see from this slide, and I wrote in my abstract, Eugene has one of the highest per capita rates of homelessness in the country. So I knew in the big picture it was a problem, but I knew in order to try to compel change, I had to understand, I had to have data to back up the anecdotal stories I heard from so many people who are unhoused. And so where I started was trying to figure out, well, what are the data sources that can help me most? And one was our municipal court. So the municipal court records allowed me to determine both the scope of the problem in terms of the number of unhoused who are on the docket on a daily basis, and then also what are the quality of life laws that most disproportionately impact the unhoused and that are the most common. And so and then the other thing, I also got public works data that involving camp closures, and then the police data that I could get. And so based upon that, the early data sets that I was able to gather, I quickly concluded that, as you can see, the four ordinances listed were the four main ordinances that people who are unhoused are subject to. And then sweeps and vehicle impoundments are also, those aren't, it's a little different, but anyway, so this is the 6 areas that I looked at most closely. And looking at the data really corroborated all the stories I heard. And as you can see from this slide, the numbers were staggering. And so what became very apparent very quickly is that Eugene is no different than any other city in the country. And then in some ways, I found it worse because Eugene can hide behind some of the seemingly innovative programs that it has adopted around homelessness, but that doesn't change the bottom line, which is that it's a very punitive approach that has tremendous costs. And so that's that's where I went next, is then looking at the cost. So one, of course, is the cost to the individual. And this gives you a little bit of a snapshot of the debt that so many people who are unhoused carry that is just absolutely futile, because it's never going to be, people will never be able to pay it back. Therefore, creating, and along with the debt, a criminal record and outstanding warrants all contribute to an inability to leave homelessness and move into housing. And then there were also, we estimated that based upon the data we did have, just looking at municipal court and public works, not even counting the most costly piece of this, which is police resources, over $2 million are spent just enforcing quality of life laws for based upon people's status. But then, so moving on beyond the local data, the other thing I knew I needed to frame it in a national framework. And also I needed to be able to show what other cities were doing. So that's where the other segments of this report cover an extensive review of successful lawsuits and research on cities that had changed certain laws in an attempt to decriminalize homelessness. And then also studies around the country that show the reduced cost of providing housing versus the staggering cost of policing the homeless. And a great starting point was the National Law Center because of their tremendous reports and other resources at the national level. So now just moving on, I want to be able to fit in a few words about how this report, is being used and how a report like this could be used in other jurisdictions. So for one, this slide, just looking at very specific ordinance changes, what can be done to even make this more manageable? So one issue is, of course, how do you reduce enforcement? But another issue is if police are compelled to give citations, how do you make this so manageable so people can get out of their situation? The other thing is thinking about system-wide changes. In Eugene, we really focus on two, which is creating an alternative dispatch system and creating a different first responder model. So it's not the police, it's trained outreach workers. And then another thing that is not in this report, but to support policy changes, is to engage in an affirmative legal representation strategy, representing individuals. And that could be done through a legal clinic. And I'm happy to talk about that more during questions. The other thing is, and this is not the first place to go, but I found a fair amount of some success working with the police. And what I learned by working with our police chief on this report is that the police need cover because they're under so much pressure from calls from citizens that they need a way to be able to show, and it's normally costs, how this is actually hurting everyone because of the cost of police enforcement. And so kind of that segues into another thing I learned from this report, which I released right before the pandemic and right before the quarantine, is to be prepared to change course and to be prepared to leverage the report in new ways. And so one, of course, was getting the city to allow people to shelter in place per CDC guidelines. And then related to that was working with the police to actually get to draft guidelines for small group sheltering in place to minimize the risk of closure. And actually, that was very successful. And we had the police do the initial draft, and then I kind of took it from there. But the point was, it was another measure to leverage this report. And then fast forward a few months after the George Floyd killing and then the pressure all over the country to defund the police, that was an opportunity to really push for these systemic changes with respect to defunding the police. And actually from that beginning, it's changing the dispatch system so calls don't go to the police, and creating an outreach worker network. They're kind of in the works, and it's yet to be seen. But what happens with that? But at least the momentum is moving forward. And I think what I'd like to end with is to just stress the importance of building a coalition of a diverse range of stakeholders. And because initially I worked mostly with people who are unhoused and advocates. What I realized quickly was to actually be able to leverage this report and anything I was trying to propose, we also needed to bring in neighborhood leaders, because the reality is, in many parts of the country, neighborhood associations hold a great deal of power. And so we needed them kind of on our side, so to speak. And then the other kind of unlikely player, but essential player, is business support for decriminalization efforts. So on that, I'm going to end with, where am I left? I'm left with this 50-page report and trying to figure out exactly what I wrote on this slide. How do I maximize the utility of this report and kind of disseminate what is most useful to the broadest possible audience? And I put a few questions up here, and I welcome your thoughts. But with that, I will end and let Brenda take over.
Thank you, Lori. Brenda, if we can turn it over to you.
Okay, can everybody see me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And can you hear me? Shake your head. Yes. Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you, Priya, for bringing me out of sabbatical to comment on Lori's paper. And I want to just note that I am not off of sabbatical. I have a full year sabbatical, so I'm not even back. And Priya dragged me out of my pajamas. So thank you, and made me put on makeup. So first of all, I just want to say that this is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful project. Lori and I talked for a very long time about it. And one of the things that we did was we bonded first about the fact that I'd initially planned to go to Oregon and do public utilities regulations and ERISA work right out of law school. And that while I am embedded firmly in the space of CED, my scholarly writing is about criminal justice. And so we really talked about that. And I really want to go in this session, to the 5 minutes that I have, to talk about the theoretical framework that Lori has asked for. And I really thought a lot about some of the rebellious lawyering work. And I also thought about pedagogy of the oppressed and a lot of the work by Freire in terms of, and Paulo Freire in terms of framing the work. But I also talked a lot to, Lori's talked a lot about the different models that she used, the different strategies that she used to collect this information. And I also think that there's some theoretical grounding there in sort of the limits of empiricism, what kinds of other kinds of research that you're doing. She talked a lot about the data and going to all of the various spaces that interact with homelessness, but she was also very much led by the voices of the homeless people. And I think that that's important as well. Also, we talked a bunch about the multiple uses of the scholarship. So she has this amazing report, which she's using. She's creating change. But I think that one of the things that the Academy can do, and one of the things that we can do, is actually sort of help people to sort of sit for a moment to actually sort of to talk about the decisions that they made or didn't make, and also to ground that more firmly in theory. I also recommended to Lori that another thing that she may want to do, and we talked about it a bit, is to connect more firmly with other empiricists or connect with the university to get some additional support for the empirical work that she is doing. And so what I'd love to see is a series of an article that talks about her work in terms of what she did, but also to talk about it as well as lawyering as well, and use some of the theories specifically around lawyering. So Lori, thank you so much for the project. I look forward to continuing to be in conversation with you as you move beyond this 50-page chock-full behemoth until to the 3 to 7 other projects that I think are already in that project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those comments, Brenda. So in the interest of time, we're going to continue onto our next paper, and it's Kimberly Budin of the University of Arkansas Little Rock, and her paper is called Inclusive Economic and Home Loan Policies for Informal Workers. And Peter Pittigoff from the University of Maine School of Law will provide comments. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kimberly. And you may be on mute. I long for the day that we will no longer hear those words.
Thank you, Priya. And thank you everyone for being here. It's really exciting to see what folks are doing, and I'm very honored to be part of this incredibly proactive group of attorney scholars. My paper is, I guess, about homelessness in the sense of a dream of how we could create permanent home ownership instead of these very vulnerable situations. This is coming out of the context of having worked in New Orleans in community economic development and affordable housing for a nonprofit, which I did for 6 years, and working specifically with post-ARA funding and building home ownership in low-income households. So I kind of start out with this recurring situation that I found in New Orleans of renters who were paying rent that was well above the PITI of the landlord, but they would never qualify for home ownership under conventional policies. And so though they were pretty stable financially, and they were also often willing to live in situations that increase the stability of that household. So multiple income earners, family members, and it was not really seen as an inferior temporary way to live, but it was very much a common New Orleans phenomenon of multi-generational households for, babysitting purposes. And it was a norm. It wasn't seen as this thing I have to do because. And so there's so much rental instability yet, despite their own stability. So you had situations with where someone had a low credit score, but they were very reliable in many other ways. They had never been late on rent, multiple income earners in one household. And then you also had renters who actually had high credit scores. But they had a very fixed income potential, and they didn't have a huge paper trail. And in both cases, there wasn't a huge paper trail of income. And so the phenomenon, the recurring problem that we would see is, the features you would see are multi-generational families or multiple income earners under one roof, multiple sources of income, and then multiple streams of non-illicit income in that household. And the results of conventional underwriting is that neither could qualify for conventional loan, and we're almost permanently in this state of flux of being forever renters because of the way that conventional loans don't consider the incomes of other earners unless they could be proven to exist for a couple of years, and income earners of non-married family members didn't count. So it got me to think about inclusive economics, as the term is often thrown around in philanthropy. But I really feel like there's a lot of space in legal academia to think about law and society, law and economics. There's a lot of room to think about how we think about inclusive economics as a way to frame legal policies and financial policies. In philanthropy, it's about including, not just women and people of color, but also rural areas. And it's often used to analyze developing nations rather than problems we have right here. Sorry, my Zoom. Okay. Oops. So a couple of things. The big obstacles are that there's a heavy reliance, in my opinion, an over-reliance on the FICO score, which, you're given kind of vague you're given big picture factors of what goes into the FICO score, but that equation is actually a trade secret that's not disclosed. Right. And so all these important financial determinations are based on this mystery equation. And then conventional lenders over rely on tax returns. And so this is very difficult for folks with informal economies, in the informal economy, to ever be essentially ever build wealth. And conventional underwriters use this very uniform metric to determine loans across the country. So it's essentially, if your housing payment is 1/3 of your income, you're considered stable. And so given the variety of cost of housing from, I'm looking at someone from New Jersey versus Arkansas, where I live. I mean, it's a pretty huge disparity, and the incomes may or may not be different. So that uniformity, I think, is dumb. I mean, I think it's bad. It's bad math and it's bad policy. Also, loan applicants aren't allowed to count roommate income. So again, I think that is the examples of that being strange is in places like New York City, right, where you have to have a roommate to survive until a very long time in your life. And it's very easy to find roommates in New York City, but you can never count that fact that you can always find a roommate to support your housing payment. You're never allowed to really use that in your underwriting process. There are some limited conditions in which you can. There's like a 2-year requirement, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, it's very hard to count roommate income as a reliable source of income. The current system has very little, allows for very little diversity that actually exists across the nation, across factors, lifestyles, and financial norms. And I do want to just clarify that when I use the term informal economy here, I'm talking about non-illicit trades and cash-based. And not for any kind of moral reason, but just because it's a completely different analysis as to policy making for informal economy and illicit trades. So I'm trying to argue in this article that inclusive economic policies, really are the answer to a more stabilized, better America. And policies that are trying to do this should recognize that our economy is diverse, particularly more localized economies, and that there is a value to these smaller, more localized economies, which you see in New Orleans. So there's a huge chunk of New Orleans is in the hospitality industry and the arts, right? I mean, everyone kind of knows about New Orleans as this cultural mega, just this monolith of culture. But the way that numbers work out is so much of that population receives income off paper from well-established hotels and clubs. And so, we need to recognize that economies vary by size and by mechanics, and that there's also a huge diversity in this country among household types. So many immigrant communities, I think across the nation, but particularly in the target areas looking at, and households of color are multi-generational households that tend to be economically stable because there is this diversification of various resources that are shared. And that both add value to our economy. I have a survey of solutions that I provide about the last half of the article. And one is about banking policies. And this is kind of a non-exhaustive list, but amongst these suggestions I make is ease off on looking at the tax return as the number one indication of reliability, and the credit and the FICO score. And also taking into account that there people who are self-employed and that there are multiple lifestyles of roommate housing that's quite normal and stable. And also look at what is going on in underwriting in other worlds. Fintech and microfinance are really looking at underwriting in a much more holistic way. And with fintech, it has been amazing that actually the default rates are slightly lower than conventional underwriting. So there is, there was so much fear behind fintech, but so far it's interesting to see that the statistics are not as scary as was played out to be. And that there should be also some consideration as microfinance does for factory loans, are basically people who are self-employed and they're working from home, and that their home actually is a source of income and integral to creating income. And then also I talk about different housing stocks. So, not everyone needs the single family home to be happy, and that there are various models that have been looked at around the country that are creating, more affordable units of home ownership that offer the stability of, a single family home. And that's kind of it. I guess my questions, I would love to hear any suggestions of where to go from here. This was my first article as an academic, and I felt like it was this cathartic, this sounds gross, but it was like vomiting all the experience that I had gained in this like kind of crazy situation of working in housing after Katrina. And so, my article that that was accepted for publication after that was specifically addressing race and lending, and looking very clearly at the disparity of lending, home ownership lending in accordance to race. But, I feel like I left some unsaid thoughts about informal economies and other segments, maybe, the artistic community and how affected they are, which is only highlighted in the pandemic right now. And so I'm
going to have to stop you there, Kimberly, but thank you. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Peter, who I'm sure will answer some of those questions.
Well, thank you, Priya, and thank you, Kim, for a wonderful paper and a great first volley if this is your first entry into legal scholarship. You gave us a real nuanced look into the informal economy and I like your focus on the cultural economy as a subset of that. And the compelling undergirding is all about the need for a more inclusive economy. You describe in pretty careful detail how so many people, workers particularly, are systematically excluded from the formal economy, especially in housing loans based on flawed assumptions, as you spell out. a system obviously that's fundamentally unfair. But I appreciate also that you explain that it's a lost macroeconomic opportunity, that it just that it's not there's loss to the entire municipality or polity when people are not included, and as well as the opportunity to improve their lives if they are. I like your taxonomy of potential solutions, very detailed, creative tools for loan underwriting, sharpening the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA demands on banks, a long-standing debate that is getting more attention now in the wake of the pandemic. You talk about zoning reforms, different types of housing, quite a wide range. I'd like to focus on one piece that I particularly love, and that is your notion of the cultural economy as a stabilizing force in the wake of deindustrialization. And to see how this notion might work on the ground, we can look abroad to the city of Berlin in Germany, an economy that is clearly boosted by a vibrant creative class of artists and freelancers. That, I don't know how familiar you are with Berlin, but it's the largest city by population in continental Europe. It includes industry and corporate heft, but its identity is defined in part by this vibrant arts community and cultural community. How do they do it? Well, the government supports it. The government gives a substantial number of grants to a lot of artists, and now in the pandemic, they're giving subsidies to artists to keep producing their work and to keep living and paying their rent. And then even without the specific artist-specific support, there's an opportunity for people to live and practice their art in an informal economy because there's a floor of public benefits, healthcare, for instance. It's not ideal. Obviously, it's Berlin, Germany. It's a special place, but there's still many gaps and tensions and racism and alt-right nationalism. There are a lot of issues there, but it does have a hint of the creative economy adding some economic stability. Or come back to the U.S. And look back to the Great Depression and the response of the Franklin Roosevelt administration and the New Deal included the Works Progress Administration. One of their projects was the Federal Art Project, where the federal government, our U.S. federal government, actually employed thousands and thousands of artists from 1935 to 1943. They created over 200,000 publicly displayed works of art. And the program was expressly to replace lost jobs and to rebuild the fabric of the community. It's happened before. It can happen again. I have to note that this was driven by one of my heroes, Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor in the FDR administration, of course, the only woman in the cabinet at the time, also the principal architect of the New Deal, which included a litany of programs born out of catastrophe. Kim discusses this pattern of major crises giving rise to progressive policy changes. She notes big ones, the Great Depression, obviously, and more recently, the Great Recession and the subprime housing crisis. And of course, now we're in the COVID pandemic. Kim and I spoke about her continuing research agenda and where she can build on this article, which has already been published. And there are a few different areas she might consider. One is to draw further lessons from extensive activity going on among community development finance institutions whose work is already touching the informal economy. Some have demonstrated success in reliability and repayment of loans. Repayment rates are good. Why? Because a lot of these organizations are close to the ground. They're tailoring their work to the needs of the borrowing community. It might be helpful to examine points of tension and resistance by conventional lenders. Why can't they do what some of these community development finance institutions are doing? How can they, what what are the barriers for them to lend in the informal economy space. Maybe the community banks and other local lenders might be persuaded and might learn from some of these ideas. I would also encourage you to, when you talk about banks, to distinguish between community banks, many of which are very much involved in local redevelopment and local economy, and national banks, which are quite distant. The other direction you might think about going, or another direction, is a deeper dive into the cultural economy, which is so central to your work for years. I think you have the potential to make the case both empirically and prescriptively for building on this artistic foundation for economic development. And it brings us to the broader question of how can the pandemic and its aftermath create further opportunities for progressive change. One small point, I'll finish up here. You would do well to expand on this notion of illicit and non-illicit activity in the informal economy. You target your analysis on what you call non-illicit activity. There's I'd say no bright line between the two, that there's a blurred border, and this distinction is somewhat fraught. It reminds me of a troubling distinction in the welfare rights debate between the worthy poor and the unworthy poor, so worth interrogating a little bit further. But I've been working in this space for a long time. In the last few years, I've seen just a resurgence of scholarship in community development, alternative enterprise forms, progressive and inclusion economic policy. And I think your work, Kim, is very valuable and forward-looking, and an addition to this body of literature.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Kim. And so let's move on to our final paper presentation. Eric Tars of the National Homelessness Law Center and Tamar Ezer from the University of Miami School of Law. Their paper is Challenging Domestic Injustice Through International Human Rights Advocacy, and the comments will be provided by Brandon Weiss of American University's Washington College of Law. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Eric and Tamar.
Great. Thank you so much, Priya, and thanks to all of you. It is such a pleasure and honor to be part of this panel and to have the opportunity to present the paper. And thank you for your patience and sticking with us. I know we're the last paper, but we're really excited to engage with you. So I'm just going to start us off, and you'll hear from both Eric and myself. The goal of this paper, I'm acting director, as Priya said, of the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law, and we've done a lot of work, a lot of different projects with the National Homelessness Law Center. We've been very lucky, and this paper really provided an opportunity to document, take stock, and reflect on 2 decades of human rights advocacy to address homelessness. And the goal of the paper is to show that it's possible to use international human rights strategies to affect domestic policy change, focusing on work to address homelessness as a case study. As Eric says, it's not just tilting at windmills. We'll see if you manage to be convinced, but we're looking for feedback on this idea, how we can communicate it most effectively, and how human rights strategies can bolster and intersect with other strategies to address homelessness. So in terms of the flow of today's presentation, in a moment you'll hear from Eric, who will discuss the criminalization of homelessness. I'll then provide a very brief introduction to the human rights framework. Eric will then describe some of the human rights advocacy to address homelessness, and then I'll end with some lessons from the advocacy.
Great, thank you. So just to start off, I've got a little thought exercise for us. Imagine a person forced to sleep on a cold concrete slab, exposed to the elements, sleep deprived, denied adequate food and water, humiliated and degraded, threatened and harassed by law enforcement. Got that picture in your head? I've got one too. And when it's these pictures, there's no doubt that it's torture or at least cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. But now, thanks to our work at the international level, it is recognized as, when it's this one, as a human rights violation, but also at the domestic level. And vitally, thanks to the domestic advocacy we've done in conjunction with international human rights standard setting, the human rights of homeless persons are now being protected and enforced by our own federal agencies and finally by our own courts. And this has been our breakthrough, that the work that we and others have done from the domestic courts to the international human rights tribunals and back again has changed policies and made an impact on the lives of the most marginalized and vulnerable in our society. And that's the good news. But unfortunately, we need this advocacy because without an ample supply of affordable housing that we've heard so much about, we've seen this mammoth growth in unsheltered homelessness over the past 10 years. And at the same time, bans on camping, on sleeping and loitering, on living in vehicles has increased by double or triple digit percentages. In a vicious cycle, unsheltered homelessness puts pressure on elected officials to, quote, do something about homelessness. And what they do is pass ordinances to pretend they're solving the problem, even when they're just making things worse. And because homelessness has a disparate effect on people of color, as well as those with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, and these communities are already subject to over-policing, unsheltered homelessness and the criminalization of homelessness hurts those who are already marginalized even more. And that's why our movement for the human right to housing is directly connected to the movements to decarcerate and defund the police. Because when it's working right, defunding the police makes things better for the police, and it frees up resources to do what needs to be done to ensure positive rights. And that's why, starting way back in 2006, we at the National Homelessness Law Center have understood that in order to get to the human right to housing, we first have to get our country to agree that it's wrong to criminally punish people for not having housing. I'll explain more about that in a minute, but let me turn it back to Tamar to lay a little of the groundwork on international human rights law.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. So I'll now provide just a brief introduction to the international human rights system. And we've heard from some of the other speakers as well as from the panel this morning about housing as a human right. So this was our chance to get a little bit more in depth and probe that concept. So the international human rights system started off with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is pictured here with Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the commission that drafted it. And the US has played a foundational role in developing international human rights law and continues to be very active in the drafting of human rights treaties. And human rights norms have also been part of our foreign policy. However, the US has been very reluctant to apply human rights norms domestically, doesn't even like to use the words human rights, prefers the terminology of civil rights. Scholars have referred to the US as a flying buttress, supporting human rights from the outside, but refusing to be subjected to human rights scrutiny. However, human rights does provide some powerful tools, which we wanted to discuss in this section. And the US has ratified several core human rights treaties. So here we can see with the red stars, treaties protecting against torture, treaties protecting civil and political rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and equality, and a treaty protecting against all forms of racial discrimination. While the US has ratified these treaties, at the very same time, it also issued a declaration that they're not self-executing. That means that they cannot by themselves serve as a cause of action in US courts. However, these treaties are legally binding, which means that they can still be used as an aid in interpretation in court, and they can also be used in advocacy with government officials, as you will hear Eric describe. The US has also, while it's only ratified a handful of core human rights treaties, it's actually signed the majority of them, as you can see from this slide. And just to draw your attention to the two red stars, there's a treaty specifically about protecting against all forms of discrimination against women. And as you know, there is really an intersection between domestic violence and homelessness. And there's also a treaty on protecting economic, social, and cultural rights. And this includes specifically the right to adequate housing. So you may ask what a signature means. So signature means that you're not legally bound by a treaty. It's just the first step. It signals an intention to be bound by the treaty. And in the US context, we also need 2/3 approval of the Senate before it is binding. So there are no obligations to take positive steps to comply with the treaty. However, there still is an obligation to refrain in good faith from acts that would defeat the object and the purpose of the treaty. And one could argue that criminalization of homelessness does exactly that. What happens at the federal level, however, is only just part of the story. In the US, we've also seen a human rights cities movement. And you can see listed here close to a dozen self-declared, self-defined human rights cities that incorporate human rights norms in some way. We also have a particularly vibrant Cities for CEDAW movement, which focuses on addressing discrimination against women. And here you can see 7 cities that have binding ordinances, CEDAW ordinances, including my own Miami-Dade County, and that are used as a basis for gender audits of city budgets, policies, and practices. Additionally, you have close to, I think it's 19 cities that have resolutions, that have passed resolutions in support of CEDAW. So in our paper, we discuss how the human rights framework is a rich source of norms. So for instance, there's the right to equality, which requires addressing disparate impacts, not just intentional discrimination. So it's a much broader right than we have domestically, and the right to housing, which requires steps to ensure housing with dignity. So it's not just a right to shelter. And this specifically entails protection against forced eviction, as well as housing that is affordable, habitable, accessible, well-located, and culturally adequate. And the Human Rights Framework further provides practical tools for political pressure and mobilization, as Eric will discuss.
So this paper really is a case study of the work that we've done since 2006, when I saw a country which had not ratified the Economic and Social Rights Treaty and whose courts had struck down notions of positive rights and decided that we needed to be strategic and, as I said, first get agreement that it's wrong to punish people for not having housing in order to lead us to a place where we agree that there's actually a duty to provide housing. And so we looked at where human rights had seen success in domestic courts, like Roper versus Simmons, where Justice Kennedy devoted a full quarter of the decision to international law. Even though finding it wasn't binding, it informed our interpretation of our own Eighth Amendment standard of cruel and unusual punishment, because the standard was so widely established across different treaties and other international and comparative jurisprudence. And luckily, there's some precedents that showed that Eighth Amendment was a viable option for addressing criminalization of homelessness domestically, but it was one that needed more support to firm it up. So we focused on creating this new, widespread, consistent norm across treaty bodies that criminalization of homelessness is cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. We started with the special rapporteurs, who are individual experts who we had developed good relationships with and have a little more freedom to comment on criminalization of homelessness. We did trainings with grassroots and legal organizations so that they could participate in official mission visits of these experts when they were planned. And where no official mission was coming, we used their annual thematic reports and press releases to build up the beginnings of this clear, consistent record. And as we developed these standards, we leveraged the international reports into meetings with domestic government officials at HUD, DOJ, and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and included this human rights analysis alongside our domestic legal and policy analysis in all of our reports. And in 2012, the Interagency Council put out a report of their own, which for the first time for any domestically focused agency talked about a domestic issue as a human rights treaty violation. And the citation for this statement links directly to our reports. So had we not included the language in our reports, the council will never have included it in theirs. And that's why it's so important for us to just start talking in this language. And once we got this language, we've been lifting ourselves up by our bootstraps into other government agencies ever since. Now, having established the norm through the rapporteur's commentary, and with the US itself conceding that it might violate our treaty obligations, we moved on to the more legalistic treaty body review process, where we could ask the treaty committees now to confirm. They didn't have to make the norm, they could just confirm that it exists. And they came through not only with the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment language that we were seeking, but also with specific recommendations that we take immediate steps to abolish criminalization. And again, we turn those recommendations back to prompt meetings with government officials to show them what we would be holding them accountable to and push them for action. And all through that education and engagement, we built allies within the government who have taken those actions to protect human rights and who are comfortable talking about them as human rights obligations. And each time we got recognition from an international source, we repeated it back domestically. And each time a domestic source echoed the international, we let the rapporteurs and the treaty bodies know how much impact their comments were having, with each side giving the other positive reinforcement and also further establishing the credibility of the norm we had created and the mechanisms themselves. And as I said, this advocacy ultimately led to a decision from the Ninth Circuit that means that homeless people are sleeping safer tonight because we brought our human rights work at the international level home to the federal administration as well as to the courts. And all this has led up to the present, where we can finally bring things back full circle from criminalization to the human right to housing. Because in 2020, despite it being hashtag 2020, through our human rights advocacy, we got half of the Democratic presidential nominees to articulate housing as a human right. And now, for the first time since FDR, we have our president-elect calling housing a right. We've also had Congress members introducing bills that actively identify housing as a human right at the federal level. And at the state level, we had constitutional amendment introduced in California that would make housing an enforceable right there. And at the local level, we had groups like the Moms for Housing and others taking over housing for people experiencing homelessness and direct actions to claim their right to housing, like Stephanie talked about on the previous panel. So I've got a lot of hope for my cause, and I also have hope that others can draw lessons from our work to make progress in other areas that Tamara will talk a little bit about now.
So unfortunately we are at time, but if this is your last slide, Tamara, you can go ahead and finish.
Great. So I just want to end briefly with drawing a few lessons from the advocacy that Eric shared. So first is the importance of investing in trainings as a basis for advocacy. Before even contacting any UN bodies, the first focus was really working with communities and trainings in communities to develop a deep understanding of human rights, and also strategically involving government officials to provide opening remarks, thereby also exposing them to human rights norms. The second is the importance of an advocacy focus. So in the early days, advocates really documented a host of different violations when it comes to homelessness. But then they realized that statements coming from the international bodies weren't necessarily strategic. So it became important to prioritize yourself and really have a clear and consistent message. Then, and I think this is really absolutely critical, is this connection of the international and domestic spheres. Otherwise, what happens in Geneva stays in Geneva and doesn't really make a difference or impact on the ground. But advocates made sure to bring the UN Special Rapporteurs to communities and use the different international processes as an opening to have meetings with government officials. And then finally, also the UN human rights system is not a monolith. So they're starting with special rapporteurs who are the most creative and flexible, then moving to treaty bodies, which are the most more legalistic, and then ending with the Universal Periodic Review and the Human Rights Council, which is more political. And then finally, which I think was a really interesting strategy, was starting with civil and political rights and negative rights with which the US is more familiar, such as freedom from torture, and using that as an entry point for a more robust understanding of rights that includes social and economic rights, such as the right to housing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone in the audience as well. Unfortunately, we are 3 minutes over, so I'm going to have to stop everything here. I apologize. This is my fault for getting on late and not understanding the strange system. But if anyone has questions for these incredible paper presentations, please feel free to email each of the paper panelists. And here is your round of applause. And thank you very much for this delightful presentation to all of our presenters and our commentators as well. Thank you.